History tells us that empires are rarely defeated by any external rival, they are usually taken down by the people within the empire. Once any global power reaches such a stature of strength and political influence as to be considered an empire, it generally has sufficient military resources as to be virtually invulnerable to outside destruction. Some exceptions to this idea exist, but mostly in our historical past. When technologically superior Western empires engaged in war with indigenous empires of the New World, the vast superiority of their military technology allowed European powers to directly conquer the empires of the Americas, as well as Africa, enslaving its people and destroying their cultures. A general rule is observed: empires destroy themselves, internally. Many of the historical empires that have imploded did so due to greed of the state, and corruption runs rife within those circles. Now if we take a look at our current geopolitical stage on Earth, we see, once again, two sides emerging. Adding to the déjà vu, once again this bipolar reality is being characterized as a Cold War. However, there are key differences between this Cold War and the period of the latter half of the 20th century which originally acquired that name. It is through looking back historically that we gain important insights from the original Cold War. It is when we examine these revelations that we see that only one side has learned the lessons of the first Cold War. Cold War I was clearly a contest of two empires. In the West, we had the American Empire. In the East, we had the Russian Empire, known then as the Soviet Union. The Russian Empire had official control of several satellite states in Eastern Europe. The American Empire had unofficial control of several satellite states in Western Europe. Who won this non-war? How did it end? The American Empire is credited, obviously, as the victor of that geopolitical contest. Where the history books, particularly those written in the US, become vague and nebulous is in describing how the US emerged as the winner. History books will tell you that it won by default. There were no overt actions or strategies, at all, which led to the victory of the American Empire in Cold War I. It won by default, because it was the only empire to survive. The Russian Empire, Soviet Union imploded, internally. The closest we can come to any American initiative which led to this outcome was the absurd arms race instigated by the Reagan regime. Having the firepower to wipe out all life on the planet only 10 times over was not considered sufficient. The psychopathic neocons who pulled the strings of the U.S.'s senile president insisted that the U.S. needed to be able to wipe out all life on the planet by a factor of at least 20. The Soviet Union attempted to follow the lead of these American psychopaths, and matched the U.S. bomb for bomb, and in doing so it self-destructed. At that time, it must also be noted that the American Empire had a much healthier, more robust economy, along with, relatively, strict adherence to the rule of law. In contrast, the fascist, not communist, Soviet Union had an extremely centralized economy, where corruption was rampant. As a result of this structural economic inferiority, the Soviet Union was economically incapable of sustaining the reckless arms race initiated by the US. However, adding arrogance to corruption, the Soviet Union refused to admit to itself that it was incapable of matching the US. The result was a simple, but catastrophic, economic implosion. Symbolically, the Berlin Wall was torn down, as the Iron Curtain crumbled. In a few short years, the Soviet Union simply ceased to exist. Its empire fragmented, as all former empires do, into its component parts. Only Mother Russia remained intact. When we flash ahead a generation, to Cold War II, we see a very, very different world. The most obvious difference is that Cold War II is a one-empire paradigm. On the left, in the West, the American Empire remains. On the right, in the East, however, we have not an empire but rather a bloc, Russia and China. A generation later, Russia has come a long way in rebuilding itself economically, from the rubble of Cold War I. Meanwhile, the world has seen the re-emergence of China. It is now universally accepted that China's economy will soon become the world's largest economy. China's currency is replacing the debauched, disgraced US dollar as the world's reserve currency, or at least the closest thing to it. While the American empire still exists and has extended its imperialistic reach, it is a very different empire from the days of the Reaganites. Most obviously, the rule of law is dead. Saturation corruption permeates this now rancid empire. Financial criminals, primarily based in the US and Israel, commit crimes literally 1,000 times larger than anything previously seen in our history, and then repeat these crimes again and again. The US Justice Department spends its time not in prosecuting and incarcerating these criminals, and criminalized banks. Rather, it expends its energies explaining why it refuses to prosecute these criminals. The primary prey of this banking crime syndicate is now the American people and the US economy itself. The United States has not merely become insolvent, it is obviously bankrupt. The oligarchs who control its puppet government literally shipped the US manufacturing base to the low-wage regimes of Asia, which ironically included China. As a result, the once envied US middle class has been transformed into the working poor. In most respects, outside of economic parameters, the American empire would be judged to be stronger than ever. Clearly this is true militarily. Despite having no real enemies since the defeat by default of the Soviet Union, US neocons have been busy as beavers inventing manufactured enemies, and then destroying them, in order to justify the continued, relentless expansion of its perpetual cycle of death and destruction. Politically, successively more fascist regimes have rendered the US Constitution essentially obsolete. Legally illegitimate, that is null and void, fascist laws have been wallpapered over the Constitution, stripping the American people of their rights and liberties. In legitimate democracies, constitutions are the ultimate law of the land, which serve primarily to protect the people from the state. In fascist regimes, invariably illegitimate governments create endless laws designed to protect the state from the people. The American empire used to represent the former paradigm. Now it epitomizes the latter. At one time, the closer that one moved toward the heart of the American empire, the more strict was adherence to the rule of law. Today, the closer one approaches to the political cesspool known as Washington, D.C., or the financial cesspool known as Wall Street, the more overpowering becomes the stench of corruption and lawlessness. In a perverse twist of fate, the American empire now mirrors the Soviet Union, in almost every respect. In the Soviet Union, voters were given the choice of two candidates, in what it called elections. However, both of those candidates represented the Communist Party. In the American empire, voters are also given the choice of two candidates, they simply pretend to represent two different parties. Incredibly, this political charade has managed to persist for at least a century. There is no material difference now in the old political parties, except which shall control the patronage. Former Congressman, Prosecutor, Charles Lindbergh Sr., The Economic Pinch, page 61, 1923. Perhaps more significantly, the American empire now bears considerable resemblance to the Roman Empire, as well. Historians are in agreement that at the time the Roman Empire was at the absolute peak of its military might, that the decline of the Roman Empire had already been underway for centuries. Where the ancient Roman Empire differs from the modern American empire is that in the 21st century, events, including the rise and fall of empires, progress much more rapidly. Roughly speaking, what used to stretch over centuries now takes place in decades. Instant communication, rapid global transportation, computerization, and numerous other technological advances are responsible for this accelerated pace of political/economic/social evolution. Morally and economically bankrupt, the American empire now relies more and more heavily on its big stick, which it wields with ever more impunity and recklessness. Statesmen such as Ron Paul and Paul Craig Roberts have regularly warned that the current generation of neocons, who wield all real power in the US government, are marching relentlessly toward World War III. However, while we see psychopaths on the left, west, we see an entirely opposite political dynamic in the east. The strengthening alliance between China and Russia represents two large, global powers which, at least at this point in time, demonstrate no imperial aspirations. But this is only one significant way in which the East differs from the West. In an essay titled Grandmaster Putin's Trap, Russian writer Dmitry Kalinichenko provides us with an insightful allegory. Cold War II is not a militarily oriented confrontation, rather it is a geopolitical chess match. The important point here is that only one side understands how to play, and win, a chess match. How does a skilled chess player achieve victory? Positioning, positioning, and more positioning. It is only once one's opponent has been completely outpositioned that any thought is given to avert attack. Chess is a game of patience, and, often, a game of simply waiting for one's opponent to self-destruct, via strategic error, or mere impatience. This brings us back to the current geopolitical stage. In the East, we see Russia and China constantly engaged in improving their position. Unlike the American empire, they are improving their economies, not cannibalizing them. They are relentlessly adding to their gold reserves. He who has the gold makes the rules, the golden rule, while the American empire has squandered most of its own reserves. While the US, and the West, in general, unremittingly alienates the rest of the world, Russia and China have been rapidly improving their political and economic cooperation with other nations. While the political, economic institutions created or sponsored by the American empire lose their legitimacy due to corruption, Russia and China are creating parallel, corruption-free institutions, to replace them. If this was a real chess match, the player on the left would have already pushed over his king, that is capitulated. The player on the right now has such superior position that the outcome of the game is no longer in doubt. However, this is not a game, but rather real life, where one side has utterly no respect for anything resembling rules. Russia and China are clearly headed for victory by default in Cold War II. The psychopaths of the American empire have demonstrated that they are ready and willing to do literally anything to prevent this seemingly inevitable outcome. For this reason, the warnings of people such as Ron Paul and Paul Craig Roberts should be given our most serious consideration. The people all over the world need to rise, and fight their governments. It is high time, that the governments fear their people, not the people living in fear of their governments. Credit for this information goes to Lornechill.